Welcome, time for some art fun. Today, we're going to learn how to use watercolor more effectively and have more fun, so stick around. My first tip really goes to the heart of watercolor, and that is the wet in wet technique. And what you'll see here is that I've wet the top third of my paper, and I'm dropping wet watercolor with a wet brush right into the wet paper. That's where the idea of the wet in wet technique comes from. During this demonstration, I'm going to show you these two different angles. I actually made this painting twice because I only have the one camera, and it's really disruptive for me to take the camera and move it from side to top to side to top. So I just did it twice. It was honestly easier than dealing with the camera stuff. So this should show you a close-up of the wet and wet technique. You could see that the paper was already wet when I started dropping wet paint right into it. And what you need to know about watercolor is it spreads. So when you drop a little bit of color, pigment, paint, however you want to say it, into the already wet paint on the paper, you'll see that spreading effect that is really quintessential for watercolor. It's what watercolor is kind of known for, and it's definitely what I love most about watercolor is how it spreads like that. It's so pretty. Now, if it goes a little too far, you can lift the color up with a dry brush, which is what you're seeing me do here. And now we're going to do that same technique, the wet and wet technique again, for the bottom third or really half of the paper. And the top is the sky, the bottom is this snowy field, and it'll kind of look like water too. You could honestly make this a sunset on the water just as well as you could make it what I'm making it, which is a sunset behind some trees and a snowy field in the foreground. But I'm doing the same technique. I'm dropping putting water everywhere, then dropping wet paint onto that, and then dropping more wet paint onto that to just continue to build up different layers. And as long as the paper is wet, you're going to continue to get these spreading effects that you're seeing right here. And that's what the wet and wet technique is all about. So when you're practicing, you could do a simple piece like this. You can paint along with me, or you can just take a scrap piece of watercolor paper and create little blobs of water and then just drop different amounts of paint into the wet area to see how this wet and wet technique works, and so that you can get a little bit more comfortable with water control with your watercolors and to see how that works for you. Now, tip number 2 is glazing, and that's what I'm showing you here. If you have a little bit less of a wet brush, a little bit less wetness of your paint than you did before, and if you have a dry piece of paper, so I've let this completely dry, and I'm just stroking that solid color all the way across as gently as I can because I don't want to lift the lower layers. I want to glaze a new color on top. And the reason you can do that with watercolor is because, unlike gouache, watercolor is not opaque, it's transparent. And so you can see your earlier layers beneath your glazed layers on top. And that's what you're seeing me do over and over here. I'm adding layers. Some of the layers, if it's a dark enough color, you might not be able to see what's underneath, but usually you really can, and it's going to affect the color of what's on top. So if you put a more pinky layer on top of a more bluish layer, you're going to see more of a purple tone. And that's a little bit of what I'm doing here in the shadows. I want it to be a bluish purple tone, and so I'm using a mix of blues and pinks and honestly just straight up purples, and I just want it to be a little bit darker. And when I noticed that the whole area wasn't dark enough, I just glazed the whole thing. And if I wanted to recover some of the whites on top of the darker parts, I want the lighter parts, I can go in with a wet brush or I can go in with a dry brush, add some water, dry my brush off, and lift the water up with the dry brush, and I'm going to be able to lift the paint right off the paper. The only time that really doesn't work is if you have what's called a staining watercolor. If you have a watercolor that when it goes down, it sort of stains the paper, so even if you lift the color, there's going to be a little bit of the residue of the original color that was down. You can't quite get all the way back to the white. But other than staining colors, you can really do a good job of lifting and at least getting back to that, what I'd originally had, which was a very pale, washed out blue, instead of just pure white for what will read as white, or what will at least read as the lightest areas. So once we have that background done and we have it the way we want it and everything dries, we can come in with the next technique, which is the wet on dry technique. And that's how I'm going to do my details. So I'm using wet paint right here on the left, picking that up on my brush, and it's just a damp brush. It's not a dry brush and it's not a soaking wet brush. And I'm going to go ahead and lay down details with wet paint on a dry piece of paper. And here's a close-up for you to see that a little bit more easily. Because the paint that I'm laying down isn't soaking wet, and because the paper is nice and dry, It's not going to spread out. It's not going to create those sort of typical watercolor effects that we were talking about in the very beginning, where you can see that with the wet in wet technique. And the result here when it dries is so beautiful, as you can see in the sky and in the general snowy areas. But once you're ready to sort of narrow it down and make it have some specifics going on, if that's the way you're going with your painting, like I am here, I'm making very representational art. It's not photorealism, but it's representational. It's supposed to be recognizable as a snowy scene in the fields, you know, with the little bit of the grasses poking through the snow, with the trees in the background. I want to be able to use the wet on dry technique so that you can see those details and you can really read what I'm trying to show you, which is this field. This is a lot of fun too, because it is so interesting how just with the amount of water that you use, you can control what happens on the page with all of these different layers that you get with watercolor. So even though if this brush were super wet, I'd be lifting and making areas of pale absence of paint on this page. And that is how you get white with watercolor. I should mention that too, because that's a huge trick with watercolor, is that you don't add whites on top of darks the way that you do with gouache or acrylic or other types of mediums. Instead, you're trying to preserve your whites as you go by avoiding painting on them. And that's why when I was doing the sky, I lifted some of the paint from the most concentrated area of where the sun would be to make sure that I'm preserving the paper, the white of the paper there. The white of the paper with watercolor is your white. It's so cool because you can add gouache on top, but you don't have to if you're keeping that preservation of whites in mind the whole time you're painting. So when I'm laying down the wet and wet technique, when I'm laying down glazes, when I'm laying down details, when I'm deciding to do a mix like you're going to see here, this is a really fun part. You can see the colors sort of bleed out. That's because I laid down a strip of water and you're seeing the color bleed out to the right into the strip. You can see it even better here. That's the water I'm just laying down in a strip, and that's going to be the base of the forest. And then with my fan brush, I just dab in, and I actually used some ink here because you know me, I can't help but do some multimedia. Even when I'm doing a watercolor demo, I have to throw some mixed media in. And so ink is going to be my mixed media here. And it really operates in a similar way. The only difference with ink and watercolor is you can't really lift it. So unless it's still wet, and even then it's definitely staining. So this is my India ink. And I'm just dabbing it in and then dabbing it up and down because in my mind, there's more concentrated stuff poking through the snow at the top further away. There are maybe bushes and things up there, smaller trees that are poking up. And then of course the taller trees that are going all the way up towards the sky. And I thought that a fan brush would be perfect for that. And so I'm dabbing that right into the wet strip and then pulling it up and down with that fan brush. And that is the other version. This is the original version, the bigger version, just doing the exact same thing. And then when I'm done getting the trees where I want them and I'm getting sort of the little shrubs and stuff at the base of the trees where I want them, I actually went back over with a dry brush and lifted up some of the paint. So you can see that strip is lighter. I wanted it to give the effect of the sun streaming through between the trees at the bottom there. And that's why I lifted some of the ink and some of the water with a dry brush. And now I'm just dabbing in a little bit more of that ink. And I also mixed some brown watercolor in too, just so it's not pure black, and dabbing that in to give the effect of the individual tree trunks. And I'm doing the same thing in both paintings, so you can see it from on top and from a little bit closer on the side with the second version that I did. So just going in, continuing to add the details. Again, you just don't ever have to feel like you're done with watercolor until you're really loving the result. You can always go back in and play with it. And I just love that. I love forgiving mediums because I'm a big fan of making mistakes and learning how to fix them. Because it's really the whole process is just making mistakes and learning how to fix them so that you can get happier and happier with the art that you're making. So here what I'm doing is I'm just going into the sort of top of the darkest areas and adding the grasses on the top so that you can tell they're poking through the highest points. And you can see that with both paintings. So just enjoy this satisfying tape peel as you see the results of both paintings. This was for me a very relaxing, very easygoing painting. It wasn't based on a photo. It doesn't have to be perfect. You should absolutely feel free to recreate this in your sketchbooks. And if you do, please tag me on Instagram so I can see what you made. I'm creating cute art on Instagram. And just as I love interacting with you all here in the comments, I would love to see you over there on Instagram and see what you're making when you're watching my videos or even after if it inspires you. And yes, sorry about that. I only just noticed the sun was directly on the page, so I closed my shade so that you could see it a little bit better. But this is the final result. I hope that you enjoyed watching it come together. I hope that you got something out of these watercolor tips. They can apply to the most complex painting and the most simplistic painting and everything in between. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. And until next time, remember, create something cute.